Record here. All right. Well, so Raim Tovim, everyone. Great to see you, to be together for our next installment of our Lunch and Learns as we're making our way through the Yoms, which I'll introduce the topic of in just a moment. But I'm very excited to introduce our guest teacher today. Let me bring him up here. There he is. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet, and now I got to bring myself up here. There we go. Still learning how to do this. I want you to meet my good friend and our good friend Ilan Bloch, coming to us live from Israel. Ilan, good to see you. I guess I should say Erev Tov to you. Nice to see you,
It's
Ilan.
7:30 here.
7:30 here. So this is perfect timing for you to miss bedtime with your kids, right? But we're really excited to welcome Ilan. I'm going to read Ilan's biography just to introduce you to him a little bit here. Ilan works as a tour guide, teacher, and session facilitator for individual tourists and adult, family, and student groups from overseas. Before making Aliyah to Israel almost 20 years ago, he worked as a Jewish studies, Hebrew, and Israel studies teacher and served as the head of informal Jewish education at the King David School in Melbourne, Australia, if you want to guess the accent. Ilan is married with twins. His twins happen to be a few days apart from my twins, believe it or not. So 4.5-year-old twins, beautiful twins. And he lives in Jerusalem with his family. He holds a ministry of tourism and a tour guide license and a society for the protection of nature in Israel. And is an authorized tour guide in Israel. He also holds a Master's of Arts degree in Jewish education and a Bachelor of Arts degree and a Graduate Diploma of Education in Jewish Studies and Hebrew Literature. So you may have figured out that Ilan is an impressive guy, and he does this all while being a wonderful Abba to his beautiful kids. And I'll just say that Ilan has become a good friend, a personal friend of mine. Ilan has he was one of our guides for our Nachshonim, our confirmation trip in Israel for many, many years. I had the privilege of traveling with him throughout Israel on several occasions. And he's a brilliant educator, but most of all, just a mensch of a person. He's someone that everyone should have the opportunity to have a cup of coffee with Ilan. So, because he's that good of a guy and just a wealth of knowledge and education. So Ilan, it's wonderful to have you with us this afternoon. Ilan's topic for today is the twisted road to independence, and we're very excited to learn with you. Ilan's going to be presenting and teaching, and I believe there will be some time for questions at the end. So be thinking about your questions. We'll have an opportunity to be in dialogue with Ilan as well. Ilan, it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Rabbi Wexler. I'll just share my screen again. Okay, so for the last year, give or take, I haven't been doing much tour guiding. I think I've guided only one day live in the flesh. Instead, because of the pandemic, because of what's happened in the tourism industry, amongst lots of other things, I've taken a sabbatical of sorts, and I've been learning Jewish studies at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies, co-educational, pluralistic yeshiva. Over the next hour or so, we're going to explore the idea of atzmaut, of independence, and how Israel marks Yom HaZikaron, which starts in 23 minutes, Memorial Day, tonight and tomorrow, and how we mark Yom HaAtzmaut, Independence Day, starting from the end of Memorial Day for another 24 hours. We're going to start in just a few moments visiting a well-known battle site just outside Jerusalem, which is called Castel, where we'll explore what happened there, remembering the Jewish soldiers who fell there in 1948, and how we remember them tonight on Yom HaZikaron. We mentioned timing, so as Israel is 7 hours ahead of the East Coast, like I said, Yom HaZikaron starts in just under half an hour, and at 8 p.m. local time, which is 1 p.m. your time, a siren is going to sound throughout the country, and the country will rise up to silently honor the fallen. When this happens, I'm going to be standing. I invite you to stand together with me and with the rest of Israel to honor those who made the ultimate sacrifice. sorry. I want to dedicate this learning to the memory of my great uncle Moshe Kamer, Zichrono Libracha, may his memory be blessed, together with 86 of his fallen comrades. He's memorialized in the Religious Company Memorial in Kiryat Gat, the picture which you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. He was killed on his 27th birthday, according to the Gregorian calendar, which also happened to be the second night of Hanukkah, hence the memorial, which is pictured above with the 2 Hanukkah candles. I want to be clear just before we start that sharing stories of what we call Moreshet Krav, or battle heritage is the literal translation, although it doesn't quite translate the idea, it is not in an attempt to glorify war, heaven forbid, but rather to honor those who paid the ultimate price. And just to make sure that how clear that is in my mind and in many people's minds here in Israel, the nation as a whole was reminded of the horror of war yesterday with the news that late yesterday afternoon, Itzik Sadian, who's pictured here in the middle, in between the memorial to my great uncle and the picture of my great uncle, Itzik Sadian, who's a 26-year-old who fought in Tzuk Eitan in the Gaza war in 2014 and suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, self-immolated in front of the Misrad HaShikum, the rehabilitation office of Misrad HaBitachon, of the Defense Ministry in Petach Tikva, just outside Tel Aviv. He was already known to a lot of Israelis who watched the news, the national pastime, after he appeared in a news article about PTSD amongst IDF soldiers 2 or 3 years ago. He remains in critical condition, and our thoughts as we begin our journey tonight are not just with those who didn't return from the battlefield, but also with those who did return and returned incomplete, whether in spirit or body or both. So I want to take us to 1948, and I want to take us to this relatively simple map of the area just west of Jerusalem. And if you see, where's my pointer? You can see in the middle of the page, in the middle of the map, there's a place called Castel, starting with a Q or K, on this map, Q-A-S-T-L, just in the middle of the map next to number 23 and just next to an area marked as a forested area. And Castel is an important and essential site in the story of Jerusalem in 1948, because it overlooks the road to Jerusalem. The road to Jerusalem is just below the Castel, just to the north of the Castel, and obviously going west all the way towards Beit Nakuba, Kiryat Anavim, Ma'aleh HaChamisha, and continuing all the way to Jaffa, Tel Aviv, and going east all along the roads, passing by Motza and what used to be Colonia, all the way towards Jerusalem. Why are we starting our tour at Castel? Because it's essential to understanding the story of Jerusalem in 1948. It's essential to understanding the story of the 100,000 Jews in Jerusalem in 1948. It's essential to understanding the story of the 1948 war. Just to make sure it's clear, marking on this map Castel, and just stressing again, on the road, just looking over the road, west to Jaffa, to Tel Aviv, east to Jerusalem. He who controls Castel and other villages on the hills overlooking the road to Jerusalem controls the road to Jerusalem. He who controls the road to Jerusalem controls Jerusalem itself. Just to be clear, today, if you want to get from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, you get on a bus or train or travel in a car or taxi pretty easily. And with the way that Israelis drive, maybe you'll be able to be here even in an hour. With the traffic that we've had for the last endless years, it's going to be closer probably to an hour and a half even. But if we go back to 1947, 1948, Jewish traffic from Tel Aviv had to travel the long way around off this map, obviously, and come to this area, which was filled not just with Castel, but with lots of other Arab villages, again, stressing the point that they were overlooking the road to Jerusalem and therefore controlling the way to Jerusalem and therefore controlling Jerusalem. Jewish Jerusalem, therefore, was under siege. What did that mean? The 100,000 Jewish residents of the city didn't have enough food, didn't have enough water, weapons or ammunition or medicine. They were in a terrible, terrible, terrible state. Just to make sure that we're on the same page to understand quite how terrible things were, you can see on the screen in front of you a sort of a handout, a PSA, which was given out to people in Jerusalem during the time of war, during the time of the siege. Today, if I'm not mistaken, the World Health Organization says that the average person needs about something like 150 liters per day in order to get by. America and other countries in the Western world certainly have more than 150 liters. And in the developing world, obviously, it can be much less than the 100 liters minimum. In Jerusalem, amongst the Jewish residents in 1948, there were 10 liters given. 2 liters which were given for drinking water. And you can see the flow chart again. We're not going to go through all the Hebrew, but just the picture on top going from right to left. So 2 liters for water for drinking, water for cooking, water to wash your dishes, water to rinse off your fruit and vegetable, water that you would use for washing your dishes and for rinsing, water that you would use for rinsing off your fruit and veg was then used to wash your hands with. Water that you would then use secondhand to wash your hands with, together with the water that you would already use to wash your dishes with, was used to go into a bucket so you could wash the floor with that. Israel, of course, Americans, Australians use mops, like I understand most of the Western world does. In Israel, we don't have mops. We squeegee the floor, basically using a damp cloth wrapped around a squeegee, a magav in Hebrew, and we use that to clean the floor. Once that was done, that water, meaning the leftover water that was still in the bucket that you might have used to wet the sponge a little bit more, and the sponge itself, which was still waterlogged, which you'd then wring out, was put into another receptacle, and that was used water for flushing the toilet. In a similar vein, you had water which was used for cleaning clothes. After you had finished cleaning the clothes and your water that you had used to clean the clothes was dirty, that water again went to use to clean the floor, to do squeegee cleaning of the floor. And again, that water that you had already used to clean your clothes with and the floor with was then used to flush the toilet with. Just to try and make sure that we understand how desperate the situation was. I want to play a song for you, which gives some indication of what this meant, which puts that poster, that public service announcement to light in a creative way. The song you're going to hear, just a short 2-minute song, is obviously, you can tell by the tone, by the rhythm, by the happiness, by the joy and how it's sung, is written after the events of the siege, almost celebrating that we're no longer in that situation. If we were to simply read the lyrics as they stand without the music, with the context that I've given, you might view the words in a very, very different way. But this song should be seen as a celebration that Jerusalem was able to have the siege lifted, ultimately.
הייתה לי כוס אחת של מים, היה זה במצור, בעיר ירושלים, לה גם כי מן הכוס, טיפה אחת או שתיים, רק ככה להרטיב קצת את השפתיים. הייתה לי כוס של מים, היה זה במצור, בירושלים, הייתה לי כוס של מים, היה זה במצור, בירושלים. בשיני ובשארית המים כיבסתי מכנסיי, פעם בחודשיים כיבסתי מכנסיי, השחירו קצת המים אז באותה הכוס כיבסתי זוג גרביים. הייתה לי כוס של מים היה זה במצור בירושלים, הייתה לי כוס של מים היה זה במצור בירושלים. כיבסתי את גרביי ובשארית המים שטפתי את הרצפה, פעם בחודשיים את הסמרטוט הלך, שחתי בידיים, השקיתי בעציץ, שושן אפילו שניים. הייתה לי כוס של מים היה זה במצור בירושלים, הייתה לי כוס של מים היה זה במצור בירושלים, הייתה של מים היה זה בירושלים, הייתה לי כוס של מים היה זה במצור בירושלים.
So truck drivers, if you were to ask someone today serving in the IDF, what do you do? And if they were to say, I'm a truck driver, they'd say it as, I'm just a truck driver. They wouldn't say, I'm such a brave, tough Israeli soldier. It's seen as a sort of a jobnik. Jobnik is this Israeli Hebrew slang for sort of a desk jockey sort of role or a schlepper role. If we were to go back to 1947, 1948, drivers were truly part of the combat elite of the Jewish Defense Forces. There was a need for 25 to 30 trucks full of supplies each and every day to try and relieve the siege of Jerusalem. And this was obviously a near impossible feat. The front and back of a convoy of trucks bringing supplies would be protected by armored vehicles, trying to secure the supplies from the front of the line and the back of the line to ensure that those in the middle would be secured. But of course, the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem back in 1948 was much narrower than it is today and much, much lower than it is today, meaning that the Arab villages on the hilltops overlooking the road had an even greater advantage than the height advantage that someone on top of those hills would have today in 2021. Benny Marshak, the culture officer of the sector, said the following: throughout military history, there was never another military unit for which the width of their battlefront wasn't even the width of a road. And it was this width which determined the fate of the state. Again, the idea that the width of the battlefront is the width of the road in and of itself. That these people were warriors, these people were fighters, these people were combat soldiers to the nth degree. Let's switch to our next slide. You can see a picture of what a convoy would have looked like. And of course, again, this was a perilous journey. Here we have a photo of those who were able to arrive safely and bring relief to besieged Jerusalem. Many didn't arrive safely. In the beginning of 1948, there were 3 convoys, not just in the area of Jerusalem, also one of them in the north, which were disastrous, which led to chaos and led to a slaughter of those brave Jewish soldiers who tried to bring some relief to those Jewish communities who found themselves under siege. Just a few stories of what it meant to be a driver back then. Some of them are a little lighter and some of them are really very, very tragic. So one brave driver said he even brought a shipment of fish with him. Just to be clear, live fish, as in the back of the truck was a tank with water with fish in it. He was a kibbutznik from Degania on the banks of the Kinneret, on the banks of the Sea of Galilee. And he was driving along and he's hearing bang, 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 bang all the way that he's driving along. What's happening? The bullets are hitting the outside of the truck, making holes in the outside of the truck, and water starts to seep out. He manages to make his way to Kiryat Anavim, to the headquarters in the area of the Haganah, of the main pre-State of Israel Jewish Defense Force, Jewish underground paramilitary group. And when he gets there, and his comrades see the back of the truck strewn with bullet holes, they laugh their heads up, but then they go about repairing it, making sure it's filled up. And he manages to make his way, continuing eastwards towards Jerusalem. And he said, this woman just came to me and said, you can't understand what a great mitzvah that you've done. Jerusalem has fish for Shabbat. Think of the joy that you've brought. Think of the Oneg Shabbat that you've brought. Another driver, a little bit of a sadder story, more jarring story, said he was only 16 years old, and his comrades were only 16 years old when they hopped on and made their way trying to break the siege and bring relief to Jerusalem. And they managed successfully to get to Jerusalem. And he remembers that a woman saw him and said, you're just a kid. They promised us soldiers. They promised that soldiers were going to come and fix the situation. And you guys are just kids. And he said he still remembers how scarred he was from the situation, how slighted he felt when he reached the city and had that said to him. Another soldier said that he saw tragically the corpse of one of his men on the side of the very narrow road. And all that he could manage to do when he saw his man who had fallen in battle was to stick his arm out and pat the poor soldier who had fallen. Another story tells of a driver who was shot as he was making his way up to Jerusalem, and he realized the danger he was in, and he put the pedal to the metal, and he managed to get through the siege. When he arrives and they're unpacking the truck that he brought, a boy asked his mother why the flour which had been delivered was red. Of course, the young boy couldn't possibly understand that the driver had been shot and had bled out while he was trying to break the siege and arrived dead on arrival. Even when you drive to Jerusalem today, for those of you who have been, you can see the burnt out shells of armored trucks which litter the side of the road. So just to remind us of that view, there's 2 points that you see just next to Shar Haggai, just next to the bottleneck, the most narrow part of the road, which has some of the highest points above it. In the lead up to Yom HaZikaron, in the lead up to tonight and tomorrow, already about a week and a half ago, the trucks are filled with wreaths and Israeli flags to try and make sure that already people understand what's about to happen, the mood that the country is about to get into. I'm going to start with talking about the Castel, but I'm just aware that the siren is going to go off in about 3 minutes. So I'm going to start very, very briefly about this, and then again, the siren will go off and we'll rise. In April of 1948, Jewish forces decide that in order to break the siege once and for all, the Arab villages commanding the road to Jerusalem would have to be captured. In the Jerusalem corridor, that road that we looked at in our first 2 maps, pre-state forces understand that they need to move from a posture of defense to offense. The Palmach, the elite squad, the strike force of the Jewish underground forces, under the command of Uzi Narkis, captures the Arab village of Castel on the 2nd and 3rd of April 1948. Today, the photo that you can see before you is the National Park of Castel. You can see the Israeli flag. Next to it, the green flag, is the National Parks Association flag just next to it. Again, about 20 minutes just outside Jerusalem. It was the first Arab village to fall into Jewish hands once the fighting broke out in Operation Nachshon, just like Nachshon, the son of Aminadav, Ben Aminadav, according, we understand, was the first to walk into the Sea of Reeds, and only once the water, according to the Midrash, got up to his nostrils did the waters of the Sea of Reeds part, and Bnei Israel was able to walk through. In the same way, this operation was called Mipsa Nachshon, Operation Nachshon, to say this, we need to take the initiative just like Nachshon did. After the capture, the Palmach evacuated most of their forces from the Castel, leaving a group of only 70 Haganah soldiers to guard the fort under the command of Mordechai Gazit. These soldiers and many, many reinforcements were able to fend off an Arab attack which was led by a man called Kamal Irakat, and this battle raged over the 5th and the 6th of April. Irakat was so embarrassed that he had lost and decided to spread misinformation that he had actually succeeded and that he had managed to lead Arab forces in reconquering the Castel from the Jews who had conquered it. On April 7th, a certain private Mordechai Meltzer, whose picture you can see, is shot in the shoulder at Castel. He shouldn't have even been fighting in the war, as he was 31 years old, and he had been in a German POW camp in Poland during World War II. And even though he was a Jew, as a POW, he wasn't murdered. I'm going to pause because the siren is going to go off in just about 30 seconds. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to open the window just to try and make sure that you'll be able to hear the siren as well. I invite, if you'd like, for you to stand together with me and the rest of Israel. So a 1 minute siren on the evening of, and tomorrow morning will be a 2 minute siren. Getting back to Mordechai Meltzer. Like I said, even though he was a Jew, as a POW, he wasn't murdered. In fact, strangely enough, he even died during the war. Again, strangely enough, he had even died during the war. So let me explain. The Red Cross had informed his family that he had been killed while trying to escape. There was obviously no funeral, but the family did sit Shiva, mourning for their relative. Then they got another message from the Red Cross. Meltzer was alive. What had happened? An Australian pilot who had also been captured by the Germans wanted to escape and asked Meltzer, who was supposed to go out into the forest to cut down trees, to switch ID cards with him. In exchange, Meltzer got his ID, which as a pilot entitled him to better prison conditions. And the Australian pilot was killed during his escape attempt with Meltzer's ID still in his pocket, leading to the erroneous announcement of his death. Once discovered, Meltzer was sent to solitary confinement. And now let's step back to 1948. After Meltzer is wounded, again to remind us, he's shot in the shoulder. He returns to his position and resumes fighting, resumes shooting. Later that evening, this man, Abdul Khader al-Husseini, the leader of the Arab Irregular Forces, the local Arab forces, the Palestinian forces, depending on your politics, how you'd like to define him, decides to visit the Arab irregulars at the site. Why is he coming? We remember that the Jews had conquered the site from Arabs, that Kamal Irakit had said, I'm going to try and conquer it back for the Arabs from the Jews, and that he had failed and it remained in Jewish hands. But Kamal Irakat was so embarrassed or was so worried as to what his commanders would do if he reported back that he had failed in his mission, that he spread misinformation back to HQ of the Arab side and said, I conquered the place. So why does this guy, Abdul Khader al-Husseini, come to Castel? Either he says, Kamal Irakat, what a brilliant job. He conquered the site. I'm going to go visit the troops, inspect the site, boost morale. Or he says that Kamal Irakat, I could never trust him. I don't believe for a second that if he said he conquered the site, I don't believe him for a second. And it's probably perhaps still in Jewish hands. It's unclear exactly what his motivation is in going to the site late at night. I'm tending to go with the first explanation, especially, I think you will too, when you hear the rest of the story. He comes to the site, and together with two of his aides, he starts ascending the site in the dark. Meir Carmiel, a sergeant major in the Haganah, sees these three figures and yells out, Tal Yajama, come on guys, in Arabic. So why is he speaking to them in Arabic? Because I know this sounds counterintuitive, but because he thought they were Jewish reinforcements, and he was playfully using a little bit of Arabic with these Jewish reinforcements. When this man, Abdul Khader al-Husseini, hears this Arabic, he says, hey, these guys are not Arabs under any circumstances. I can hear a bad Arabic accent, even in the middle of the night. And he realizes that if he answers back in his Arabic, he's going to be shot at. Instead, he tries to pretend that he's a British soldier. And he says in his best Queen's English, hello, boys. His best Queen's English is not quite good enough. And the Jewish soldiers on top of the Castel, on top of the hill, realize that there's something wrong here, that British soldiers don't sound like that, that sounds like Arabs or other locals trying to put on a British accent, and it's something suspicious. Carmiel opens fire and kills Abdul Khader al-Husseini, the man in the picture, together with his two aides. They walk down the hill, they inspect the three bodies, they look at what they're carrying, what weapons they're carrying, they look at the IDs they're carrying, they see one ID, they see another ID, they see the ID of Abdul Khader al-Husseini. And you know what they say? Nothing, because they have no idea who Abdul Khader al-Husseini is. They don't have a clue that this is one of the greatest local Arab Palestinian warriors in Palestinian history, even still today, till 2021. They don't know that he's the leader of the sector in the leader of the Arabs in the Jerusalem sector. Later on, Haganah forces, not at Castel, but in the area, intercept an Arab radio transmission saying that the bird has fallen in the cage. And they sit on this transmission and they say, the bird has fallen in the cage. It's good that we've got the ability to overhear what the Arabs are saying on their radio communication. It's good that we've got Arabic speakers amongst us and we were able to translate it. What would be much, much better is if we were able to understand what on earth the Arabs mean when they say the bird has fallen in the cage. On the morning of the 8th of April, the Jewish forces at the Castel come under attack because the Arabs believed that al-Husseini hadn't been killed, but rather had been taken captive by Jewish forces at the Castel. And it becomes very, very clear what that meaning was. the bird has fallen in the cage. Oh, this massive Arab attack, the bird has fallen in the cage. They think that we've got Abdul Qadir al-Husseini. The attack is massive. In the fighting in 1948, there's a system called Fa'aza, whereby Arab soldiers call out to Arab locals to join in a short, intensive battle before returning to their homes. So what does it mean? Soldiers, real trained soldiers, real fighters, call out to the locals. Someone says, I'll stop harvesting my field, I'll stop planting this, I'll stop sharpening tools, I'll bring a gun, I'll bring a knife, I'll bring whatever I have, and I'll come for battle. And battle will finish after a couple of hours, and then I'll go home for dinner. It means that you've got a lot of untrained soldiers, irregulars coming, but it means that you've got a lot of soldiers coming, thousands upon thousands upon thousands. The Castel is absolutely, absolutely overwhelmed. And the Jewish forces retreat under the motto of the company commander, Shimon al-Fassi, who says the privates will retreat and the commanders will stay behind to cover them. It's a revolutionary idea in 1948. If you think of what had just happened in World War II and World War I, not talking about the Holocaust, in the wars, what happens? Commanders, generals sit, they move pieces on a risk board, so to speak, on a map of the world, while they're smoking cigars and drinking cognac. The people in the field, the senior officers send out the privates, the cannon fodder, out to be killed, to clear the way for them. Here it's a totally, totally, totally revolutionary conception. We, the senior officers, we're the ones who will do the covering because we're responsible for you. We led you into battle, we'll be the first one out, and we'll be the last one back. A private Meltzer is wounded again, this time in the thigh, and notwithstanding al-Fassi's order, he's physically unable to retreat and hides instead. And this time, the Castel, just to be clear, is conquered by the Arab force, but they make the same mistake that the Jewish forces made the first time round. If when we conquered it the first time round on the 2nd and 3rd of April, we left only 70 soldiers there to secure the area, this time the Arabs leave even less than 70 soldiers. They only leave 40 soldiers. Why only 40? Not because they don't understand the significance of the site, but because anyone who was anyone and a lot of people who were nobody were only at one place on that day. They were coming to the funeral of Abdul Qadir al-Husseini. This was your moment that you would tell your grandkids, your great-grandkids about. I was at the funeral. I was at the funeral of our Gadol Hador, our greats of our generation, and nobody wanted to miss it. The funeral was on top of the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, according to the Muslims. Obviously, they had discovered his body and they had taken his body to be buried. This time, the 40 Arab members who are there at the site are overcome on the 9th of April by Palmach members who are able to conquer the site with minimal resistance. The 40 Arab members, 40 soldiers who are there to hold the site basically just flee. Finishing the Castel just with Private Meltzer to close the circle to understand what happened to him. His body isn't among the dozens of corpses strewn across the battle site, and he is listed as MIA, missing in action. Only much later were his bones identified among dozens of unknown soldiers buried in a temporary grave up the road from Castel at Ma'aleh Hamisha, just around the corner from Castel, just up the road, just west from Jerusalem. They were reinterred, of course, at Mount Herzl, at Har Herzl, where the national memorial ceremonies will take place tomorrow morning. In 1953, with the First Lady, we don't really have a First Lady, but the President, his wife, Rachel Yanait Ben Zvi, attending the ceremony. And Meltzer's nephew, Israel Milrod, said she was amazing. She went from family to family, caressing each one and comforted us as if she was everyone's mother. Something quite exceptional to hear that someone would do that. And I want to just take a moment to again stop and remember, imagine and remember the sacrifice that these brave soldiers made in order to secure the road to Jerusalem. And perhaps this Yom HaZikaron, and perhaps even more so last Yom HaZikaron, when we were in the height of the pandemic, and now when we still haven't yet emerged from the pandemic, perhaps unfortunately we can relate somewhat to the idea of sacrifice in these two particular years of Yom HaZikaron, this year and last year, when we consider the devotion and sacrifice of medical professionals and other frontline service providers. Let's move towards Yom HaZikaron. And tonight and tomorrow, we remember the 23,928 Jewish and Israeli fighters and soldiers who have been killed and who have died in conflict since 1860. 1860, because that's the year that Jews left the walls of the old city of Jerusalem and started the first neighborhood of Jews outside the walls of the old city, Mishkanot Sha'ananim, which I'm sure many of you have been to, or you will be to in the future. This includes 44 who were killed during the last year, including one who was killed in a training exercise. We stop for a moment and we say, Yehi Zichram Baruch, may their memory be blessed. And I know that the average American who doesn't personally know or isn't personally connected to someone who served in the armed forces might think of Memorial Day, American Memorial Day, perhaps as a day off or a day of great sales when they think of Memorial Day. Certainly in Australia, Anzac Day, our Memorial Day at the end of April, was seen also as a day of a public holiday, a day of a football game, a seminal football game of the year. And before they allowed gambling, before casinos opened up in Victoria, it was the one day where you were allowed to gamble as well. Of course, Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron in Israel is certainly a very, very, very different experience. So we have the siren, like I said, both the one that we stood for together, the 1-minute siren at night, and tomorrow at 11 a.m., the 2-minute siren, which gives everyone an opportunity to stop and honor the dead, even if they can't come to a tekes, to a memorial ceremony themselves. And we'll see what that looks like for those who haven't been in Israel for the siren in just a few moments. And of course, a mass pilgrimage to the grave sites of the fallen soldiers. So last year was an exception to that rule, where they closed the cemeteries even to bereaved families. This year they've said you can only go to a cemetery if you're an immediate family member of a fallen soldier. And there was a little bit of an outcry, and then there was a clarification that they said, this is only a recommendation that we strongly recommend, but we're not going to enforce it, which means that tomorrow will probably most likely look similar to most other years of Yom HaZikaron in terms of the masses coming to pay their respects at Har Herzl and other military cemeteries. Let's just have a look at what the siren looks like in the middle of the day. to do a little bit of our own honoring of those who fell, the 23,928, I want to share with you a poem which is often read at Yom HaZikaron memorials, which was written by Natan Alterman to honor those who fell in 1948. He took the notion of a silver platter of Magasha Kesef from a speech that Chaim Weizmann gave at the Federation in New York in 1948, saying, pay up, open your wallets, the state's not going to be handed to us on a silver platter, we need your support. Va'aretz tishkot, you can see the English to the left and the Hebrew to the right. Va'aretz tishkot ein shamayim odemet, tam'em leitar gvulot hashanim, ve'uma ta'amod kruat lev ach noshemet, לקבל את הנס האחד אין שני. היא לטקס תיקון, היא תקום למול השר, ועמדה למולם אותה חג ואימה. אז מנגד יצאו נערה ונער, ואט יצעדו הם אל מול האומה. לובשי חול וחגוג בכבדי נעליים, בנתיב יעלו הם הלוך ואחרש. הם החליפו בגדם, לא מחו עוד במים, את עקבות יום הפרח בליל קו האש. עייפים עד בלי קץ, נזירים ממרגוע, ונוטפים צללי נעורים עבריים. דום השניים יקשו ועמדו עד בלי נוע, ואין אות אם חיים הם או אם ירויים. אז תשאל האומה שטופת דמע וקסם, ואמרה מי אתם? והשניים שוקטים, יענו לה, אנחנו מגש הכסף, שעליו לך ניתנה מדינת היהודים. כך יאמרו ונפלו לרגלה עודפי צל, והשאר יסופר בתולדות ישראל. I want to, before we move towards Yom Ha'atzmaut, offer a hope and a prayer that one day the idea of sacrifice will come to mean living your life rather than giving your life for a cause in which you believe. Again, to stress that here we pay respects to those who paid the ultimate price, but certainly we choose life and we pray for the day when Har Herzl won't be filled up with more and more graves each and every year. So, moving forward, Israeli forces managed to take control over the western side of Jerusalem. The eastern side, including the old city, including what you see before you in this picture, including the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, including the southern wall and the western wall, and all of it remains under Jordanian control between 1948 and 1967. Only with the Six-Day War, on the third day of the Six-Day War, will Israeli forces manage to seize this area from the Jordanians, and 2.5 weeks after the end of the war, they'll pass effective protocols, effectively annexing this area to the state of Israel. Inside this area, I want to take you to one other site that some of you may have been to. And this is, sorry, I'm going to take one step back. If that's what the mountain looks like today, the slide that I just showed you, the slide that I'm showing you now is a model. Those of you who have been to the Israel Museum, or in the olden days, I guess 17 years ago, or earlier than that, to the Holy Land Museum, you would have seen a model of Second Temple period Jerusalem. And this is a close-up just of what the Second Temple would have looked like, the renovated Second Temple, which would have stood on top of that mountain that we see today, the Dome of the Rock on. 2,000 years ago, Jews would come here 3 times a year, the Shalosh Regalim, on Sukkot, on Pesach, and on Shavuot, to go to the Temple Mount to bring a sacrifice. They'd change money and they'd buy an animal sacrifice in the shops below this magnificent arch that you'll be able to see in just a moment. This is what it would have looked like 2,000 years ago. Below this arch, perhaps the biggest arch in the Roman Empire, It's Robinson's Arch, which had a monumental staircase on top of it, leading up to the Temple Mount. On the street below, if you didn't go up the staircase, you'd find yourself next to the Western Wall, which wasn't used for praying. People would have thought you were crazy. It would have been like praying at Macy's today. Rather, it was a place for shopping. What would you do? You'd change your money and buy local currency. You go and dip in a mikveh. You might buy a lulav and a drug if it was Sukkot. You would make sure that, again, stressing the mikveh, that you were pure, that you were in a proper and fit state to go up to the holiest place in the Jewish calendar. Today, the site looks a little bit more like this. The arch was destroyed by the Romans. You can still see the outline of the shops. You can see a tourist, when there used to be tourists, a tourist walking along the streets, walking past the opening of what used to be a shop. Most pilgrims would enter the Temple Mount not via this Robinson's Arch stairway, but rather through one of these 3 gates, which have obviously been subsequently sealed off after the Second Temple period. And they pay a temple tax like synagogue Jews today and go up to the Mount to offer their sacrifice. Just to make sure we're on the same page, the word for pilgrimage in Hebrew is aliyah laregel, which includes the word ascent. And although pilgrims were physically ascending, they were going upstairs, it was thought, obviously, as well, that they were ascending metaphysically or spiritually as well. Again, stepping back to the context of the pandemic just for a moment, the idea that experience wasn't just about going somewhere physically, it was also about going somewhere in your mind, your guts, your soul, in your essence. And perhaps the last year, with the amount of time that we've spent on Zoom and other platforms and living virtually, we can somehow come to understand this idea, not just in the context of something so obvious where the parallel works, such as a virtual tour like this, but even in other contexts, in other places where we've been transported maybe to our grandchildren, to our children, to our friends' homes, even when we weren't visiting one another because of the pandemic. I don't want to learn this this Mishnah. That's not the purpose of me bringing it. It's an interesting Mishnah, but it talks about those who would enter the Temple Mount and they go through the 3 gates that I just showed you that were sealed off afterwards. Circle. What does circle mean? You do what you needed to do on top of the Temple Mount. Meaning, what was the main thing people did? What was the most important thing that people did on the Temple Mount? What was the purpose of the temple? To be able to bring sacrifices. And that's the point that I want to come towards finishing off on. There's lots of different sacrifices that Jews would bring for various things. If you gave birth, you bring one sacrifice. 40 days or 80 days after the birth, whether you're giving birth to a son or a daughter, you bring 2 turtle doves. Different sacrifices, the Paschal sacrifice that you ate with your family or your clan on Pesach. And of course, there was something called a Korban Todah, a Thanksgiving offering. The sacrifice was eaten, obviously it's a meat sacrifice. The sacrifice was eaten with bread and in a group. And it's not by accident that I've brought us to this point, because tomorrow, not tomorrow, in 2 days' time, on Thursday, on Yom Ha'atzmaut, everyone, and I mean everyone, even me, who's a vegetarian, I'll be doing it vegetarian style. Everyone will be having a barbecue. And perhaps, and again, just to stress, every square foot of any public space, any public park on Thursday, pretty much all day, is going to be filled by families and groups of friends having a barbecue to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut and to hang out. Perhaps, some of them are subconsciously inspired, maybe even without knowing it, by the idea of the Thanksgiving offering, the Korban Todah, which was brought in the temple. Perhaps this barbecue isn't simply just a barbecue, isn't even simply just a secular barbecue, a national barbecue, perhaps there's some underlying religious link or religious, historical, spiritual link. Just to finish off before I stop to see if there's any questions. So I know a lot of you have been to Israel before, and a lot of you want to come back, whether for your first time or for a subsequent visit. And those people who might have been already and be equivocating whether they want to come back for a subsequent visit, I want to stress how much things are changing on a regular basis. Just 3 weeks ago today, 4 national parks opened, new national parks. One of those national parks is the Shar Hagai National Park. On the left-hand side, which talks about all the things that we talked about in the first half of the presentation, the battle for the road to Jerusalem and so on and so forth. You can see the picture on the left-hand side is sort of audiovisual presentation imagery from the museum, from the Memorial Museum, trying to illustrate what that meant, the road to Jerusalem, and some of the relatively lower hilltops above the road to the left and to the right. And on the right-hand side is a picture of the Khan, the old Ottoman Muslim period inn on the way to Jerusalem, which was converted to be used for this memorial site, for this memorial purpose. And you can see, if you look just to the left of the photo on the right-hand side, you can see the road signs. You can see the blue sign saying Tel Aviv this way. Again, stressing this idea of what it meant to be on the road to Jerusalem, what it means to be on those lands overlooking the road to Jerusalem. If you control those hilltops, you controlled the road, which meant that you controlled Jerusalem. I want to thank you for the last 55 minutes together. And I want to stress, I'll pause for questions in just a moment, but to share some good news. The government has talked about May 23rd being the beginning of the reopening of tourism to Israel, that the government will authorize 10 to 20 groups that will come in as a sort of a trial groups to see how the whole situation might work in the context of the pandemic, with the hope that in July, more groups will be able to come. Sorry, in June, more groups will be able to come. And that with the great hope that in July, even individual tourists and families will be able to come from July onwards. I'm hoping that's the case. I'm hoping that's going to happen. And I hope that I'm going to be able to see you in Israel. And I hope that should you come and want a tour guide to help you discover the land, to discover the stories of Israel, and to encounter Israel, I'm sure that I'll be happy to step up to the plate. My details are here on the final slide, basically teaching Israel, one word, as a website, as email, WordPress blog. You're welcome to visit and to subscribe and to follow and connect and like on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook. And of course, the first link is to, if anyone for some reason has contacts, business contacts in the United Arab Emirates or in Bahrain, you can also send them my way through the Emirati Visit Al-Aqsa website. So I'll switch off the share screen.
All right. Well, I first want to say Toda Rabah. Thank you so much, Ilan, for that history lesson and the tour. And I must say that I found it very moving. I've never experienced hearing the siren in Israel from while standing here in the United States. I've been in Israel for various sirens, but that was a very powerful moment. So thank you. We're going to open it up for a couple of questions. I know that we are going a little bit over time here, but I want to make sure that if we have a couple questions that we can ask those. I will say that anyone who would like help getting in touch with Ilan, I'm very happy to give out his contact information. He is truly the best when it comes to guiding and educating in Israel. And hopefully we can all be traveling to Israel in the near future. So with that, let me take a look and see if there are any questions. I see that Charles put a question in the chat, Ilan. I don't know if you can see it as well. He wants to know about the chronological and geographic relationship of Latrun to Castel.
Okay, great question. Thanks, Charles. So Latrun is about, I guess, 25 minutes to the west. If you're continuing along the road from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, 25 minutes further towards Tel Aviv. The stories are linked. I didn't want to get into too much detail about the road to Jerusalem just because of the limitations of time. But the British will withdraw from Latrun as they're packing up in the lead up to May 14th. And it will fall after 3 major and 2 minor battles. It will remain in Arab hands, and it won't be part of the state of Israel between 1948 and 1967. While the British were there, ironically, even though obviously it's not great to have the British occupying your country, it allowed for some level of relief for the Jews. At least they were able to make their way towards Latrun. At least things got even more difficult once the British had left. I know it's a very, very short answer. I'm just cognizant of time, and I'm very happy if you want to write to me or stay on afterwards for a fuller answer. I'm happy to give to you. The story of Yad Mordechai. So there's a kibbutz just around the corner from what will become known as the Gaza Strip, which held off Egyptian forces who were making their way up the coast towards Tel Aviv to conquer Tel Aviv. And they held the Egyptian army off for 6 days, which was absolutely extraordinary. The Egyptian army, granted, wasn't at the same level as the Jordanian army, which was filled with the British. The majority of the officer class was British trained or actual British soldiers. The Egyptian army wasn't quite at the same level, but they were massive in terms of their size. And they were trained enough, and they were overwhelmingly, it was certainly the few against the many in terms of the Jews against the Arabs in this respect. The fact that they were able in this particular case, fewer soldiers, fewer medical first aid staff, fewer ammunition, fewer weapons, fewer supplies that they were able to hold off is something which is quite incredible, and certainly affected the course of the war. The Egyptians were able to ultimately get not to Tel Aviv, but the delay that they had at Yad Mordechai, the 6-day delay, with a lot of other factors as well and a bit of luck, meant that they couldn't get to Tel Aviv, that they were stopped along the coast at what today is an intersection linked to a bridge that's called Ad Halom intersection or interchange, or Ad Halom bridge. Ad Halom meaning up until here, as in the Egyptians were able to get up until here. And they ended up realizing that they wouldn't be able to get all the way to Tel Aviv. And they started detouring and saying, well, if we can't get to what we were meant to conquer, then at the very least, let's go and get some glory in Jerusalem. And started moving towards Jerusalem, even entering the outskirts of Jerusalem, just next to, just in the southern area, the southern tip of Jerusalem, at Kibbutz Ramat Rachel. For those who have been there, Egyptian forces, along with Jordanian forces, attacked the kibbutz in 1948.
Great. Thanks, Ilan. Is there one more question? Or are we, okay. Just looking around real quick. All right, well, I want to thank everyone again so much for joining us today and for this series, which will continue next Tuesday. And I'm happy to announce that Ilan is going to be back with us 2 weeks from now, teaching another session. So we look forward to welcoming him back to Cherry Hill. And in the meantime, I hope everyone has a wonderful day. And toda rabah again to you, Ilan, for being so generous with your time and your expertise. And thank you for all that you do. We look forward to seeing you again. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
very much.
Ilan.
Excellent.
Thank you,
Thank you,
excellent
Ilan.
presentation.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Great presentation.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure.